Clara Whitmore pressed both hands flat against the wooden table to stop them from shaking. Around her chairs scraped across the grass as families gathered their plates and moved not quickly enough to be obvious, just far enough to make the message clear. She was not welcome. She had not been welcome anywhere in Red Hollow since the morning they pulled Thomas out of the canyon 6 days ago, and the whole town decided without a single question asked that her dead husband was a thief. She had brought bread. She had brought preserves she put up herself in July. She had come because she did not know what else to do with the grief that had been eating her alive in an empty cabin with no one to talk to and nowhere to go. She did not expect forgiveness. She only wanted to sit among people. Instead, she got silence and empty chairs. If this story moves something in you, if you have ever been left standing alone when you needed someone most, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment telling me what city or town you are watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me, and I read every one. Now stay with me because what happens next at that church supper is going to change everything. The summer of 1883 sat heavy on Red Hollow, Colorado. The way heat always did in the valley between the mountains pressing down on the rooftops and the dry grass and the people going about their Sunday business with the slow, self-satisfied certainty of folks who believed they already knew everything worth knowing about everyone around them. Clara Whitmore had lived in that valley for 11 years. She had raised chickens on that land. She had planted a kitchen garden every spring and canned vegetables every August and hung laundry on the line behind the cabin while Thomas worked the claim and came home smelling of pine dust and cold mountain air. She had been a neighbor. She had been a church member. She had been a woman who brought soup when someone took sick and sat up at night when a baby came early and sent bread without being asked. She had believed in the way a person believes in something without ever examining it too closely that the people of Red Hollow knew her. She understood on that Sunday afternoon that she had been wrong. It started before she even reached the long tables set up beneath the cottonwood trees at the edge of the churchyard. She saw it in the way women turned their heads when she walked through the gate, not the natural turning of people noticing an arrival, but the deliberate practiced turning away of people who had already decided. She saw it in the way conversation dropped to nothing in the cluster of men standing near the water trough. She saw it in Ruth Hadley, who had borrowed Clara's good iron pot 3 winters ago and kept it for 6 months without returning. It took hold of her daughter's arm and steered the child firmly in the opposite direction, as if Clara were a hole in the ground that needed avoiding. Clara kept walking. She had made herself a promise that morning, standing in front of the small mirror in the cabin still wearing the black dress she had put on the day they brought Thomas home and had not been able to bring herself to take off since. She had made herself a promise that she would not cry in public. She would not apologize. She would not defend herself to people who had not asked her a single question. She would carry herself with her spine straight and her chin level, and she would sit at that supper, because Thomas had sat at that supper every year for 11 years, and she was not going to let rumor and cowardice drive her off the land she had every right to stand on. She found a spot at the end of the long wooden table, farthest from the center of the gathering. She set her basket down. She placed the bread and the 3 jars of strawberry preserves she had spent 2 days making in a neat line in front of her. She folded her hands in her lap, and she sat. Within 4 minutes, the 2 families seated closest to her had quietly gathered their plates and relocated to a different table. She did not look up. She looked at the untouched plate in front of her, and she breathed slowly, and she did not cry. Clara Whitmore. The voice came from her left. She did not recognize it immediately. A low, unhurried voice, the kind that belonged to someone who had spent a great deal of time in places where speaking too loudly disturbed something important. She looked up. She had seen Caleb Mercer before, in the way that everyone in Red Hollow had seen Caleb Mercer at the general store twice a year at the assay office, occasionally passing through town with his pack mule and his silence and his reputation as the cattleman who ran a small operation up in the high grazing country above the valley and wanted nothing to do with anyone's business but his own. He was not a young man. He was not an old one either. I was somewhere in that range of life, that the mountains made a man look weathered and quiet and solid, with gray at his temples, and a seriousness around his eyes that did not read as unfriendly so much as simply careful. He was standing beside the empty chair 2 seats down from her, holding his hat in one hand. "Ma'am," he said, "you mind if I sit here?" Clara looked at the empty chairs between them. She looked at the empty table. She looked at the rest of the churchyard, where she could feel without seeing it the way every set of eyes had found her in the last 30 seconds. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "I suspect you know that sitting anywhere near me today is going to cost you something." "I reckon," he said. He pulled out the chair beside her, not 2 seats down beside her, and sat. He set his hat on the table and reached out and picked up the nearest jar of preserves and turned it in his hands, studying the color through the glass, the way a man studies something he intends to respect. "Strawberry," he said. "Yes. You put these up yourself." "I did. They look like good work." He set the jar back down. "Move your plate closer, ma'am. You're not eating alone today." Clara Whitmore had not cried once since the morning they brought Thomas's body down from the canyon. She had not cried when the sheriff came to her door. She had not cried when Walter Grayson stood on the steps of his bank and told anyone within earshot that Thomas Whitmore had stolen from the workers and gotten what dishonest men deserved. She had not cried at the burial, standing alone at the grave, while the preacher read the words in a voice that carried no warmth, with only 2 people close enough to witness the thing: Caleb's neighbor boy, who had liked Thomas, and an old miner, who was half-deaf and may not have fully understood what was happening. She did not cry now either. But something shifted inside her chest, some tightly wound thing that had been holding itself together through sheer determination, and she had to press her hands flat against the table for a moment and breathe. "They'll say things about you," she said quietly. "People generally do," Caleb said. He flagged down a woman passing with the breadbasket, thanked her politely, and helped himself without appearing to notice that the woman looked at him the way you look at a man who has just done something you cannot quite classify. "You want bread, ma'am? I brought my own." "Then eat it." He broke a piece of his own and set it on his plate. "You walked all the way down here carrying a basket in this heat, and you haven't touched a thing. That's a waste of good preserves." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her fork. Around them, the churchyard buzzed with something that was not quite conversation, more like the collective intake of breath that comes just before a storm. She could feel it. She knew he could feel it too. He did not appear to find it particularly interesting. "You've been up in the grazing country," she said, because silence between strangers felt like something that needed managing. "Came down yesterday," he said. "Heard there was a supper." "Did you hear anything else?" He looked at her steadily. "I heard what people are saying about your husband." She nodded once short and controlled. "I also heard," he said, "that nobody seems to have asked you a single question about any of it." That particular observation arrived somewhere behind her sternum with considerably more force than she expected. She set her fork down. "No," she said, "they haven't. That strikes me as peculiar." He reached for the preserves again and opened the jar, a gesture so ordinary and unhurried that it felt almost like an act of protest. A man dies in the mountains, and the town makes up its mind about his wife before she's even had time to grieve. They made up their minds about Thomas. She kept her voice level. "The story was already decided before I knew he was gone." "What story is that?" She looked at him. The question was not casual. It was direct, and it was weighting, and she recognized the difference between someone asking to fill up empty air and someone asking because they actually intended to listen to the answer. "The story," she said carefully, "that Thomas Whitmore stole money from the Workers' Relief Fund, that he had been stealing for months, that when the banker discovered it, Thomas ran and fell in the canyon trying to escape." She paused. "That is the story Walter Grayson has been telling since the morning they found him. Is it true?" The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. "No," she said. And then, because she had been holding the truth alone for 6 days, with nowhere to put it and no one to give it to, "It is not true, not one word of it." Caleb Mercer did not look surprised. He did not look disbelieving either. He simply nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected, and spread a careful measure of strawberry preserves on his bread. "Tell me," he said, "what is true." She told him. She told him the way a woman tells a story she has been carrying alone, not in a straight line, but in pieces. The way grief and fear and anger all come out together when someone finally gives them room. She told him about the night 3 weeks before Thomas died, when he came home from the relief fund office later than usual, quieter than usual, with something behind his eyes that she had not seen before and had not been able to name. She told him about the papers he had brought home and spread on the kitchen table after supper, ledger pages he had copied out by hand in his careful, deliberate handwriting, numbers and dates and entries that didn't balance the way they should have. She told him Thomas had believed for months that someone was taking money from the fund, small amounts at first, amounts that could be explained away as errors, and then larger ones, amounts that could only be explained by intent. The fund collected dues from the miners for exactly the kind of emergency a man encountered in the mountains: accident, illness, a widow left without income. Thomas had joined the oversight committee because he believed in the purpose of the thing. He had started reviewing the records because something small nagged at him. What he found, when he looked carefully, was not small at all. "He told me he was going to bring it to someone he trusted," Clara said. "Someone outside of Red Hollow. He didn't trust anyone in town, not the banker, not the sheriff, not the committee members. He thought some of them might be involved. He say who? He was careful with me." Her voice did not waver, but it cost her something. "He didn't want me to know more than I needed to. He said it was safer." She stopped. "He thought if something happened to him, knowing less would protect me." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Around them, the supper had resumed its noise, though she was aware that the table nearest to theirs, close enough to hear if someone tried, had filled back up with people who were working very hard at the appearance of not listening. "When did he die?" Caleb asked. "They found him on a Thursday. He had left 2 days before Tuesday morning. He told me he was riding up toward the Garnet Pass claim to check on something. He didn't say what." She looked at her hands. "He didn't come home Tuesday night. I told myself he had stayed at the claim. Wednesday night I was frightened, but I didn't. I didn't know what to do. And then Thursday morning, 2 of the sheriff's deputies came to my door." "Who found him?" "They said it was a trapper working the canyon trail. They said he must have ridden too close to the edge in the dark." She stopped. Thomas knew those trails. He had ridden them for 11 years. He did not take unnecessary risks in the dark. "No," Caleb said quietly. "I don't suppose he did." She looked at him directly. "You knew him?" "Not well. But I knew him to speak to up in the high country. He was a careful man." A pause. "Careful men don't fall off canyon trails they've ridden 100 times. She had not said those words to anyone. She had thought them every night, lying awake in the dark cabin, thought them so loudly that she was surprised no one could hear. But she had not said them, because saying them meant stepping into something enormous and frightening and dangerous, and she had been alone with them, and being alone with something enormous and frightening and dangerous for 6 days does something to a person. "Caleb Mercer." The voice came from the direction of the nearest cluster of men, and both Clara and Caleb looked up at the same moment. Sheriff Elias Boone was a tall man with the particular kind of largeness that comes from having been unquestioned for a long time. Not just physical size, but the carrying of himself, the way he moved through space, as if it belonged to him by arrangement. He stopped on the other side of the table from them, and looked at Caleb with an expression that was working hard to stay pleasant and not entirely succeeding. "Surprised to see you down from the mountain," Boone said. "Summer supper," Caleb said. "I try to make it when I can." The sheriff's eyes moved to Clara and back to Caleb. "Surprised to see where you chose to sit." "Found a good spot," Caleb said. He did not elaborate. He picked up his coffee cup and drank from it with perfect composure. Boone let a pause develop that was intended to be uncomfortable. "You understand this woman's husband robbed from his neighbors, from working men trying to protect their families." "I understand that's what I've heard people saying," Caleb said. "I've also noticed nobody seems to have asked Mrs. Whitmore what she knows about any of it." "There's nothing to ask." Boone's voice developed an edge. "The records speak for themselves. Thomas Whitmore's name is on every withdrawal." "His name," Clara said. Her own voice surprised her, steady and cold and clear, in a way she had not planned for it to be. His name, not his signature. Both men looked at her. She had not intended to say it here in public at a supper table, while half the town strained to listen. But the words had been sitting in her chest since the morning she had stood in Grayson's bank trying to look at the fund records and had been told the investigation was closed and the records were secured and she had no standing to request anything. Thomas's handwriting, she said, is not on those withdrawal records. I have seen Thomas's handwriting every day for 11 years. I know what it looks like. The name on those records is not his hand. Boone's expression did not change. That in itself told her something. Mrs. Whitmore, he said with the careful patience of a man who has practiced that patience specifically to use on people he considers inconvenient. Grief does things to a person's mind. It makes them want to find explanations that aren't there. Your husband is gone, and I understand that's a terrible thing, but the evidence— Let me ask you something, Sheriff. Caleb's voice was still unhurried, still that same even unimpressed tone. Those records you're referring to, where are they being held? A flicker of something crossed Boone's face. Secured at the bank under investigation. Federal investigation. The flicker again. Town investigation. That's so. Caleb nodded slowly, as if filing that information in a useful place. And who's conducting it? The matter is being handled by Walter Grayson's bank, under Walter Grayson's oversight, investigating a fund that Walter Grayson administers. Caleb looked at him steadily. That's what I thought. Boone was quiet for 3 full seconds. The silence between them was not comfortable for anyone, but Caleb appeared to find it perfectly manageable. I'd be careful, Boone said finally, about the kind of trouble you step into, Mercer. A man minding his own business tends to stay out of difficulties. I appreciate the advice, Caleb said. He did not look the least bit appreciative. We're still eating, Sheriff, if you don't mind. Elias Boone stood there for 1 moment longer. 1 moment in which the entire churchyard held its breath, and then he turned and walked away, and Clara felt the air come back into the space around them. She looked at her plate. Her hands, she noticed, were completely steady. That surprised her. He threatened you, she said quietly. He suggested I mind my business, Caleb said. Those are different things in my experience. It amounts to the same. Maybe. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Whitmore, these papers your husband copied out the ledger records. Do you still have them? She looked at him. The question was important, and they both knew it. Yes, she said. I have them. Where? She shook her head slightly. Not here. Not with 8 people close enough to hear if they leaned in. I understood. He nodded once and said nothing more about it, and they finished what was on their plates in the quiet of 2 people who have found themselves accidentally on the same side of something large and do not yet know quite what to do with that. Around them, Red Hollow ate its Sunday supper and pretended not to watch. Walter Grayson stood at the far end of the yard with a glass of lemonade in his hand and watched Clara and Caleb at the end of that long table with an expression that his wife, had she been paying attention, would have recognized as the expression her husband got when something had gone wrong that he had not accounted for. He had not accounted for Caleb Mercer. He had not accounted for Clara Whitmore refusing to disappear. He set down his lemonade and went to find the sheriff. She walked home that evening along the dry road with the empty basket over her arm and the jars of preserves wrapped in cloth. Caleb had taken one, and she had pressed the other 2 on him before she thought better of it, and he had accepted them without making it strange. The evening was cooling. Somewhere up in the tree line a hawk called once and went quiet. She thought about Thomas, not the Thomas of the last terrible weeks. The quiet, worried man with the copied ledger pages spread on the kitchen table and the fear he was trying to keep from showing in his face. She thought about the Thomas of 11 years, the man who came home smelling of pine dust and brought her wildflowers for no reason and laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. The man who had joined a miners' committee because he believed people deserved to have someone honest looking after the things that mattered. That was the man they had buried under a thief's reputation in hard mountain soil. She pushed open the cabin door and went inside. She went to the kitchen shelf where the tin of coffee sat, the one Thomas had ordered from the Denver supplier, because he said life was too short for bad coffee, and she reached behind it and pulled out the oilskin packet he had made her promise to keep hidden. The ledger copies. 3 pages covered in Thomas's even careful handwriting the real records, and the altered ones side by side with his notes in the margins, explaining what each discrepancy meant. She spread them on the table and looked at them in the last light coming through the window. She had looked at them every night since the deputies had come to her door. She had looked at them, and she had known what they meant, and she had not known what to do with what they meant, because there was no one to take them to, and she had been afraid. She was still afraid. She did not think that was going to stop. But today, a man she barely knew had sat beside her at a supper table when every other soul in Red Hollow chose empty chairs. He had listened to her. He had asked the sheriff the right questions in exactly the right tone. He had taken a jar of her preserves and treated it like it mattered. She folded the oilskin packet carefully and held it in her hands. Thomas had been careful to protect her. He had died being careful. She was going to have to stop being careful. She did not know yet exactly what that meant. She did not know how much was coming, or how fast, or how dangerous the road from this kitchen table to any kind of justice was going to prove. She only knew that for the first time since Thursday morning, she was not sitting inside her fear alone. She pressed the packet flat against the table and smoothed the oilskin with her palm. Outside, the summer dark settled over Red Hollow, and somewhere up above the valley in the high grazing country, where a careful mountain man was riding home with a jar of strawberry preserves wrapped in his saddlebag, the shape of what was coming was already beginning to form, patient and determined, and very, very far from finished. Clara Whitmore sat at her kitchen table in the dark, and she did not reach for a lamp. She sat in the dark, and she thought about Thomas, and she thought about the records on the table in front of her, and she thought about a man who had crossed a churchyard to sit beside a woman everyone else had decided to abandon. She thought about what it meant that he had asked where the papers were. She thought about what it meant that she had told him she still had them. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and put on water for coffee. Because tomorrow was a new day, and new days in the mountain country required hot coffee and a clear head, and she had work to do. The truth was not going to deliver itself. Someone had to carry it. He came back the next morning before the coffee had finished boiling. Clara heard the horse before she heard the knock. A single set of hooves on the dry road, unhurried, stopping at the gate. She was already at the door when Caleb Mercer knocked, and she opened it before he could knock twice. He looked at her face and did not waste time. "You slept," he said. "Some," she said. Which was not entirely true, but it was not entirely a lie either. She had slept in the chair by the kitchen table with her hand on the oilskin packet, which she supposed counted for something. "Come in." He came in and stood in the center of the kitchen with his hat in his hand, the same way he had stood at the supper table the day before, present and solid, and without the particular kind of restlessness that men got when they were in a place they did not intend to stay. He looked at the table where she had left the coffee things, and she poured 2 cups without asking, and set them down, and they sat. She put the oilskin packet on the table between them. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it, then at her. "You thought about this overnight," he said. "I did. And I want to know," she said carefully, "what you intend to do with them, before I open that." It was a fair question, and he knew it. She could see that he respected it, not in a showy way, not the performed respect of a man trying to earn something, but the genuine respect of someone who understood exactly why the question had to be asked. "I intend," he said, "to find out who killed your husband. And then I intend to make sure the right people know what I found." The right people being who exactly? "Not anyone in Red Hollow," he said. "That much I know." She looked at him steadily. "Walter Grayson has been running this valley for 12 years. He controls the bank. The land contracts half the water rights above the creek. Elias Boone has been his sheriff for 9 of those 12 years. The men who sit on the town council eat at Grayson's table." She stopped. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand that the problem is bigger than most people want to look at," he said. "Yes. Then I want you to understand something else." She folded her hands on the table. Thomas was not a reckless man. He was not an impulsive man. He spent 4 months being careful, Careful with the records. Careful with what he said to me. Careful about who he trusted. He was careful right up until the moment someone followed him into the mountains and made sure he didn't come back. She paused. Careful did not save him. Caleb was quiet. I am not going to let it be for nothing, she said. What he found, what he carried, what it cost him, I am not going to let that disappear, because the men responsible have powerful friends and an obliging sheriff. She slid the oilskin packet across the table toward him. But I need to know you understand what you're stepping into. He reached out and opened the packet. She watched him read. He read the way Thomas had written, carefully, methodically, going back and rereading a line when something in it needed double-checking. She watched his face, which was controlled but not blank, and she saw the moment about halfway through the second page when something shifted behind his eyes. He turned to the third page and kept reading. When he finished, he set the pages down flat and looked at her. These withdrawals, he said. The ones with Thomas's name attached. Yes. They started 8 months ago. 7 months and 3 weeks before he died, she said. He noticed the first discrepancy 5 months ago. He thought it was a bookkeeping error. He started copying records 2 months after that. And he brought these home, 3 weeks before they found him in the canyon. She kept her voice even. He told me to keep them hidden. He told me if anything happened to him, these papers were the only thing standing between his name and whatever story someone else decided to tell. Caleb looked at the pages again. The signature on these withdrawal records, you said it's not Thomas's hand. It is not Thomas's handwriting. I have 11 years of his letters and his notes and his record books. I know his hand the way I know my own face. She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a folded paper, a letter Thomas had written her 4 years ago. Ordinary and domestic, asking her to order more lamp oil when she went to the store. She spread it on the table beside the copied ledger pages. Look at the formation of the letter W. Thomas closed the bottom of his W with a slight hook going right. The signature on the fund records hooks left. Caleb studied both papers in silence. You noticed that, he said. It was not quite a question. I am his wife, she said. I noticed that the second day after they found him when I went to Grayson's bank and asked to see the records, and he showed me just enough to make his point before he put them away. She looked at the letter and the ledger copies lying side by side on her kitchen table. Whoever signed those records studied Thomas's handwriting well enough to fool a man who had never looked closely. They did not count on a woman who had. Caleb sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Outside, somewhere down the road, a wagon passed. The ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in a small Colorado town, a dog barking a screen door, the distant clang of the blacksmith starting early. Red Hollow going about its business completely unconcerned with the fact that the entire foundation of what it believed about Thomas Whitmore was sitting on a kitchen table in 3 pages of careful handwriting. All right, Caleb said. Here is what I know from my own observation, separate from what you've told me. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table. I have been running cattle in the high country above this valley for 11 years. I know those trails the way I know my own hands. The section of trail where they say Thomas fell. I rode that section 2 weeks ago on my way down for supplies. There is one place where the trail comes within 8 feet of the canyon edge. One place. And it is a place any rider with half his wits about him would see in full daylight and avoid without thinking. He paused. They said he died Tuesday night. That is what the deputies told me. There was a full moon Tuesday night. I remember because I was checking a fence line by moonlight that same evening up at the top of the South Ridge. He looked at her directly. Mrs. Whitmore, a man who knew those trails would not go over that edge in full moonlight, not by accident. The word accident landed between them, and neither of them pretended it was the right word. She had known it. She had known it since the deputies stood in her doorway with their careful faces and their careful language. She had known it lying awake for 6 nights with Thomas's absence in every corner of the cabin. But hearing it settled by someone else. By someone who had his own evidence, his own observation. Something that existed outside the walls of her own grief did something to her. She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. Then we agree, she said, about what happened. We agree, he said. The question is what we do with it. The question, he said, is where the rest of the evidence is. He looked at the ledger copies. These are Thomas's copies of the records. The originals are in Grayson's bank. A federal investigator is going to want the originals. Grayson controls the originals. He does now. But Grayson is not the only person who has ever touched those records. He was quiet for a moment. The fund committee has 3 members besides Thomas. Who are they? She thought. Harold Pence, who runs the feed store, James Calloway, the mine foreman at the Henderson claim, and Reverend Aldous. Reverend Aldous, Caleb said slowly. He's been the pastor at Red Hollow Chapel for 20 years. He doesn't involve himself in money matters. He sits on the committee as a moral authority, I think more than anything practical. Which means he probably hasn't looked at the records closely enough to know what was changed. Caleb considered. But Harold Pence, the feed store, he's been running that business for 30 years. He knows numbers. You think Pence saw something? I think a man in business for 30 years who sits on a money committee either knows what's in the records or he has a reason for not knowing. He met her eyes. One of those possibilities is a lot more worrying than the other. Clara thought about Harold Pence, a round, cheerful man who always had a kind word and remembered the names of everyone's children and dogs. She thought about the way he had looked at her at the church supper yesterday. He had not been the first to move his chair away. He had been the 3rd or 4th. He had looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot afford to let himself feel sorry about. He knows, she said. He knows something, Caleb said. Whether he's involved or whether he's frightened is a different question. Is there a meaningful difference if he knew and said nothing while they buried Thomas as a thief? There is a difference legally, and there may be a difference in terms of what he is willing to do now. He looked at her steadily. A frightened man can be convinced to stop being frightened. A guilty one is a different problem. She was quiet for a moment. The coffee had gone cold, and she did not care. What are you proposing? She asked. I'm going to ride back into the mountains today, he said. I'm going to find the place where Thomas went over that canyon edge. I've been in those mountains long enough to know what a man in a hurry leaves behind, and what a man who did not go over willingly might have left behind. He folded the ledger copies back into the oilskin carefully and slid the packet back across to her. You keep these. Hide them somewhere besides behind that coffee tin. She almost smiled at that. Almost. And while I'm up there, he said, you need to be careful. Don't go to the bank. Don't go to the sheriff's office. Don't talk about those papers to anyone. He paused. And if Grayson or Boone come to your door, you answer their questions pleasantly, and you tell them nothing. And if they're not pleasant about it, send word to me. The Gilroy boy at the end of your road does errands for me sometimes. If something happens, you tell him to ride to the Upper South pasture and tell Mercer to come down. She looked at him. You're treating this as if it is already dangerous. It was already dangerous, he said quietly. The moment Thomas started copying those records. We are just the people who have to decide what to do about it now that he's gone. He stood and picked up his hat and then stopped. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. All right. Are you afraid? She thought about it. The honest answer was not a simple one. Yes, she said. But I have been afraid for 6 days, and it has not stopped me from doing anything that needed doing. I don't think it's going to start stopping me now. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the quiet cousin of one. No, he said. I don't suppose it is. He settled his hat on his head. I'll be 3 days, maybe 4. Keep those papers close. He left, and Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of his horse going back down the road until she couldn't hear it anymore. Then she picked up the oilskin packet and went to find a better hiding place. She considered the floorboard beneath the kitchen shelf, the one Thomas had always meant to nail down, and never quite gotten to the one that lifted half an inch on the left side if you pressed the right edge. She considered the lining of her winter coat, hanging in the wardrobe. She considered the gap behind the stone in the chimney that Thomas had mortared imperfectly and always promised to fix. She chose the chimney stone. She worked the mortar carefully with a knife, Not disturbing the surrounding stones, slid the oilskin flat into the gap and pressed the stone back into place. If someone searched the cabin, and she did not think they would not yet, but she was no longer operating under the assumption that not yet meant never, they would have to know exactly where to look. Then she washed her coffee cups, set them on the shelf, and went to find Harold Pence. She had not planned to do that. Caleb had told her to be careful to say nothing to wait. She had listened to all of that with complete seriousness, and she did not disagree with any of it in principle. But she knew Harold Pence in a way that Caleb did not, and she knew that Harold Pence was the kind of frightened man who would find his courage faster in a private conversation than in any formal proceeding. And she also knew that frightened men had short memories when it came to what they had decided to forget. She was not going to let him forget. The feed store was 2 blocks from the post office, set back slightly from the main street, with a loading platform on the side, and sacks of grain stacked inside the wide doorway. Harold Pence was behind the counter when she walked in, talking with one of the Henderson mine workers about an order. He looked up when the door opened, and his expression, she saw it distinctly. A flash of something genuine, before he got his face under control, was not hostility. It was guilt. She waited until the mine worker took his receipt and left. "Clara," Harold said. His voice was careful. "I didn't expect—" "I know you didn't." She came to the counter and set her hands flat on the wood and looked at him directly. "I am not here to make trouble for you, Harold. I am here because Thomas is dead, and the wrong story is being told about him, and I think you know enough to know the story is wrong." He did not deny it. That told her everything. He looked at his hands at the counter, at the space over her left shoulder. He was a man trying to find a direction to look that wasn't directly at her, and every direction he tried had something in it he didn't want to face. "Clara," he said, "I have a wife. I have a business. I have—" "Thomas had a wife," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut. He had 11 years of mornings in the Colorado mountains, and a name he had spent his whole life making decent, and now that name is buried under a lie. She did not look away from him. He sat on that committee because he believed in what it was supposed to do. He died because he found out what it was actually doing. And I am standing in your store because I need to know if there is one person in this town who is going to let the truth mean something, or if I am going to have to carry this alone all the way to a federal marshal's office while the man who killed my husband shakes hands on the church steps on Sunday." Harold Pence's hands, pressed flat on the counter, were trembling slightly. "The records," he said very quietly. "The records were changed. I noticed it not right away, maybe 2 months ago. Small differences. Amounts that didn't match what I remembered from the previous quarter." He stopped. "I told myself I was misremembering." "You weren't misremembering." "No." His voice dropped further. "No, I wasn't." "Did you say anything to anyone?" Howe was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she understood the answer before he gave it. "Grayson called me in," he said at last. "A month ago. Before Thomas, before everything. He called me in for what he said was a routine review. He sat me down in his office and he was very pleasant about it. He poured me coffee." Harold looked at the counter. "He told me that irregularities in the records had come to his attention. He said the committee would be conducting an internal review. He said it would be better for everyone, for the business community, for the families who depended on the fund, if the matter was handled quietly internally, without causing unnecessary alarm." Another pause. "He said some committee members might find themselves personally liable if a formal investigation determined there had been negligence in oversight." Clara's hands pressed harder against the counter. "He threatened you." "He was very polite about it." Harold's voice had something in it that was almost shame. "He was very pleasant. He shook my hand at the end of the meeting and told me he was glad we understood each other." She stood very still. "And then Thomas died," she said. "And then Thomas died," Harold said. The feed store was completely silent. Somewhere outside, a horse clopped past on the road, the ordinary world continuing. "Harold." She looked at him steadily. "When a federal marshal comes to this town, and one is coming, I promise you that you are going to have to make a decision. You are going to be able to tell what you know, and be the man who helped bring the truth out. or you are going to protect yourself and be the man who watched Thomas Whitmore get buried as a thief and said nothing." She picked up her hands from the counter and straightened. "I am asking you to start deciding now which man you want to be." She left him there with his trembling hands and his coffee order and his guilt, and she walked back out into the Tuesday morning and turned toward home. She had gone half a block when she became aware of footsteps behind her, quick, purposeful gaining on her. She turned. It was Deputy Ray Cutter. Young mid-20s with the kind of face that hadn't quite decided yet what kind of man it belonged to. He had been with the sheriff's office for 2 years. She knew him by sight. He stopped when she stopped. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He was breathing slightly hard, as if he had hurried to catch her. "I saw you come out of the feed store." "Good morning, Deputy." "I need to—" He glanced back toward the main street. "I need to talk to you." "Not here." She looked at him carefully. He was nervous, not the performed nervousness of someone delivering a threat, but the genuine uncomfortable nervousness of someone who was carrying something they didn't know what to do with. "My cabin," she said. "This evening, after 6. He nodded, quickly looked back over his shoulder again, and walked away without another word. Clara stood on the dusty road and watched him go, and felt something complicated move through her, not quite hope, because hope was a thing she had learned to handle carefully since Thursday morning, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized the shape of things beginning to shift. She went home. She spent the afternoon doing ordinary things with extraordinary concentration, sweeping the porch, checking the kitchen garden Thomas had planted, and she had not been able to bring herself to neglect mending a tear in her work apron. She kept her hands busy because her mind was doing things she could not quite control, yet spinning through everything. Harold Pence had told her. Everything Caleb had said that morning. Everything the deputy's face had communicated in that 30-second exchange on the road, at 10 minutes past 6. Ray Cutter knocked on her door. She let him in and gave him coffee, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and stared into it for a moment before he spoke. "I want you to know," he said, "that I didn't know. When they brought your husband down from the canyon, I didn't know what had happened." He looked up at her. "I thought it was an accident. I thought what the sheriff told us." "What did he tell you?" "He told us Thomas had been moving money, that he had been caught and panicked and ridden out that night to run and gone over the canyon edge in the dark." His jaw worked. "He told us Thomas had a buyer lined up in Denver, that he was planning to disappear." He put down the cup. "And I believed it. I am sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. I believed it because it came from the sheriff, and because the records seemed to show it, and because—" He stopped. "Because it was easier to believe it than to look at anything else." She watched him. She did not interrupt. "3 days ago," he said, "I was in the office. Boone was out making rounds. I was alone. And I was looking for a supply order. I thought I'd filed in the wrong cabinet. And I opened the wrong drawer." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He set it on the table between them. She did not touch it yet. "What is it?" she asked. "It's a letter. From Grayson to Boone. Dated 6 weeks ago, 2 weeks before your husband died." He looked at her steadily. "It talks about the committee review. It talks about the records. And it talks about Thomas Whitmore specifically." He paused. "It says that if the committee member in question continues pursuing the discrepancies, the matter will need to be resolved through other means." Other means. Clara picked up the letter and read it. Her hands did not shake. She was finished with shaking. The letter was exactly what Ray Cutter had described: careful language, the language of men who wrote things down while keeping plausible distance from what they were actually saying. Resolved through other means. The matter cannot be permitted to reach external authorities. The current situation presents unacceptable risk to the parties involved. She read it twice, folded it, and set it down. "Why are you bringing this to me?" she asked. "Why not the sheriff?" He looked at her as if the question was almost too simple to answer. "The letter is from Grayson to the sheriff, Mrs. Whitmore. The sheriff is one of the parties involved." "Then why not go over his head, the territorial office?" "I've thought about that." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Boone has friends in the territorial office, has had for years. I'm a deputy who's been on the job for 2 years. If I walk in there with a letter that implicates the sheriff and the banker, and I don't have anything else, no other corroboration, no other witness, I lose my job, and the letter disappears, and nothing changes. He looked at the folded paper. But if someone else, someone outside the sheriff's office with their own evidence, if they go to a federal marshal with enough, then your letter becomes one more piece of a larger picture, Clara said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. There is another piece of evidence, she said carefully. Someone who is finding it right now. She looked at him. Can you keep this letter safe for 3 more days? I've kept it safe for 3 days already. 4 more then. She leaned forward. And deputy, I need to know something. The men who rode with the search party when they found my husband. Who were they? He hesitated. I need to know, she said. Boone himself, 2 of his regular deputies, Keller and Marsh, and a man named Cord Purvis, who does occasional work for Grayson's bank. He paused. Purvis is not a man I would trust behind me on a dark trail. Cord Purvis. She filed the name into the part of her mind that was building a structure out of all of this. Thomas's copied records. Harold Pence's admission. The forged signature. Caleb's knowledge of the trail. And now a letter from Grayson to Boone, talking about resolving things through other means, and a man named Cord Purvis, who rode with the sheriff when they went to find a body they may already have known would be there. Thank you, she said. Come back in 4 days, and be careful. After he left, Clara sat alone in the lamplight and looked at the chimney wall where the oilskin packet was hidden, and thought about Thomas, and all the careful patient work he had done, and all the careful patient work that still remained. Grayson and Boone were not panicking. Not yet. They believed they were still in control of the story. The town believed it. The records appeared to support it, and the widow was just a grieving woman making accusations no one wanted to hear. They had not yet understood what was coming down from the mountains. She banked the fire and went to bed for the first time in 6 nights, and lay in the dark, and thought of Caleb somewhere in the high country above the canyon where Thomas had died reading the ground. The way a man who has spent 11 years in those mountains reads it, looking for what gets left behind when someone tries to make a murder look like an accident. She thought about what he would find. She thought about the 4 days between now and whatever came next. And she closed her eyes, and the dark was no longer quite as complete as it had been, and she slept. 3 days later, Caleb Mercer rode back into Red Hollow before dawn. He came directly to her cabin. He knocked twice quietly, and she was already at the door because she had heard the horse. He came inside, and she poured coffee without a word, and he sat and opened his coat and placed 3 things on the kitchen table. The first was a short length of rope cut clean, not frayed, with one end looped and knotted in a way that rope loops itself only when it has been used to bind something. The second was a small blood-darkened piece of paper torn from something larger with 2 lines of handwriting on it that she recognized instantly in Thomas's hand, in Thomas's closed-bottom W. The third was a metal button, the kind that came off a particular style of work coat sold at one specific supplier in the Denver catalog. She had seen that style of button before. She tried to remember where. He didn't fall, Caleb said. It was not a question. It was a statement of what the ground had told him, and his voice carried the weight of 4 days in the mountains alone with that knowledge. The rope was wedged under a rock 15 feet below the canyon rim. The paper was caught in a rock crack on the slope. A piece of whatever he'd been carrying came loose when he stopped. He was a man who said what needed to be said and stopped when it was said. The button came off someone's coat. It was caught in the brush right at the canyon rim. On the side of the trail, a rider would stand if they were. I didn't finish that sentence either. She looked at the button. She looked at it, and she thought about where she had seen that particular style, that particular size. And then she thought of Cord Purvis, and the name settled into her chest like a stone into still water. She looked up at Caleb. I know whose button that is, she said. He looked at her. Tell me, he said. Cord Purvis, she said. Caleb did not move. He looked at her across the kitchen table, with the 3 pieces of evidence between them, the rope, the torn paper, the button, and he waited. He wears that style of coat, Clara said. The Denver catalog cut double-breasted brass buttons with the eagle stamp. I have seen him in it twice. Once at the assay office when Thomas and I went in to file a renewal on the claim. And once... She stopped. The memory arrived with a physical sensation, something cold moving through her chest. Once 3 weeks before Thomas died. He was standing outside the bank when I came out. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just looked. You remember the button specifically. I remember everything about that moment specifically, she said, because something about the way he looked at me made me want to cross to the other side of the road. I did not know why then. She looked at the button on the table. I know why now. Caleb picked up the button and turned it in his fingers once. Then he set it down. Cord Purvis does occasional enforcement work for Grayson, he said. I've heard his name connected to 2 evictions in the last 3 years. A family on the North Creek lost their water rights after Purvis had a private conversation with the husband. Man packed up and left within a week. He paused. He is the kind of man powerful people hire when they need something done that they cannot put their own name on. Deputy Cutter told me Purvis rode with the search party that found Thomas. Caleb went still. Cutter, he said. The deputy came to you. 3 days ago. He had found a letter Grayson to Boone, written 6 weeks before Thomas died. She got up and went to the chimney wall and worked the stone loose and brought out the oilskin packet. She set it on the table and then reached into her apron pocket and produced the folded letter Ray Cutter had left with her. She placed both in front of Caleb. Read the letter first. He read it. She watched his jaw tighten, a small controlled movement, the only outward sign, and then he set it down and looked at her. Other means, he said. That was Thomas, she said. That was what they called my husband. A situation requiring resolution through other means. The kitchen was very quiet. How much does Cutter know? Caleb asked. He knows what he told me. He knows about the letter. He knows Purvis rode with the search party. He does not know about the physical evidence you found. She paused. He is frightened. But he is not the kind of frightened that makes a man useless. He chose to come to me. Or he was sent to find out what you know. She looked at him. I considered that, she said. I considered it while he was sitting at my table, and I watched his face through the whole conversation. He was not performing. The guilt on that man's face was real. The kind of guilt that has been living in a person for days and getting heavier. She folded her hands. I have been reading people in small towns for 41 years, Caleb. I am not wrong about Ray Cutter. He accepted that. Not blindly, she could see him weighing it, but he accepted it. All right, he said. Here is what we have. He laid it out with the precision of a man who has been alone in the mountains for 3 days, thinking through exactly this. Thomas's copied records showing the fund withdrawals and the discrepancies he identified. A letter in Grayson's own hand, instructing Boone to resolve the situation before it reached external authorities. A rope, a piece of Thomas's paper, and a button placing Cord Purvis at the canyon rim on the night Thomas died. Harold Pence's direct knowledge of the record alterations, which he can testify to, and a deputy willing to produce the letter officially. He stopped. That is enough to open a federal investigation, but not enough to close one, she said. No, not yet. He looked at the evidence spread across the table. The original records are in Grayson's bank. If he knows we are moving toward a federal marshal, those records disappear. The withdrawal ledgers, the fund accounts, everything. He has had 9 months to make sure any physical trail inside that bank is covered. Can we get to them first? Not legally, not without a federal order. He was quiet a moment. But there is something else. The fund payments, the actual money transferred out. Grayson had to move it somewhere. A man running a scheme like this for 9 months across a dozen withdrawals has a paper trail beyond the fund records themselves. Bank transfers, account ledgers, transactions with the Denver office, which are also inside Grayson's bank. His Red Hollow Bank, yes. But the Territorial Banking Office in Colorado Springs holds copies of all chartered bank transaction records, required by territorial law. He met her eyes. Grayson knows his Red Hollow records. I doubt he has considered what is sitting in Colorado Springs. Clara was still for a moment. "You're talking about going to Colorado Springs," she said. "I am talking about sending someone to Colorado Springs," he said. "Someone who has legal standing to request the records. A widow whose husband was accused of financial crimes has standing to petition for a review of transactions made in his name." He looked at her. "You have standing, Clara." It was the first time he had used her name without the formal address. Neither of them noted it aloud, but she felt it a small, quiet shift in the nature of the thing between them, like a door opened an inch. "Colorado Springs is 4 days' ride," she said. 3 hard. He paused. "I am not suggesting you go today. I am suggesting that when we move on multiple fronts simultaneously. Federal Marshal Territorial Banking records, and the evidence we have in hand, all of it at once too fast for Grayson to shut down any one piece before the others are already in play." She looked at the evidence on the table. "Then we need more time." "We need 4 days," he said. "Maybe 5. "Does Grayson give us 4 days?" He was quiet. That was its own answer. She stood up and went to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment. Not because she couldn't face the conversation. She had been facing hard conversations for 6 days without flinching. But because she needed a moment to let the full size of it settle into her without someone watching her face while it did. Thomas had known this. He had known when he copied those records and pressed the oilskin packet into her hands and told her to keep it hidden, that this was where it led. Not a neat and simple revelation in some bank office, but this, all of this, a tangled, dangerous structure of frightened men and powerful men and a dead man's evidence and a mountain's worth of careful work still ahead. He had known she would have to carry it. She turned around. "What do we do first?" she asked. He told her. The first thing was Reverend Aldous. She had not put much weight on the Reverend when she had listed the committee members to Caleb 3 days ago. A moral authority, more than a practical one, she had said, unlikely to have looked at the records closely. But Caleb had been thinking about that differently. A man who had sat on a money committee for 4 years, even one who did not involve himself in the specifics, would have signed off on certain reports. Quarterly summaries. Annual fund reviews. His signature would be on documents that predated the alterations, which meant his memory of those original figures, approximate imperfect but genuine, could establish a baseline that contradicted Grayson's current version of the records. "He's not a hostile witness," Caleb said. "He's an uninvolved one, and uninvolved witnesses are valuable because no one has bothered to threaten them yet." She went to see Reverend Aldous that same morning, while Caleb went to the telegraph office to send a carefully worded inquiry, through a coded reference, they agreed on. Not a direct message to a federal marshal contact he had dealt with 2 years prior over a land boundary dispute. Reverend Aldous received her in his small office beside the chapel. He was a gentle man, white-haired and slow-moving, with the kind of face that a life spent listening to people's troubles had made permanently soft. He looked genuinely distressed when she sat down across from him. "Clara," he said, "I have been meaning to come to you. I am ashamed that I have not." "I need your help," she said. "Not your apologies, your help." She told him what she needed. Not everything, not the button or the rope or the full weight of what was sitting on her kitchen table. She told him about the discrepancies Thomas had found. She told him that the withdrawals attributed to Thomas did not match the fund records from earlier quarters. And she asked him what he remembered about the annual review signed 3 years ago. The figures, the totals, the general state of the fund at that time. He remembered more than she had expected. "I was not a financial mind," he was careful to say. He did not work with numbers the way Thomas or Harold Pence did. But he remembered the quarterly total from the last annual review because it had struck him as a particularly good number, a sign of the community's generosity, and he had mentioned it in his Sunday sermon. The figure he remembered was $4,700. The current fund records, as Grayson had presented them to the town Thomas's death, showed the fund had never exceeded $3,200 in its history. Clara looked at the Reverend across the desk and let that number sit between them for a moment. $1,500, she said. "I understood." She watched him understand, watched the careful, gentle face go through something complicated and arrive somewhere that was not quite shock, because some part of him had known something was wrong. She thought the same way Harold Pence had known the way. People often know things they do not allow themselves to look at directly. "Will you write down what you remember?" she asked. "The figure, the date of the sermon. Anything you can recall about that quarterly review meeting." "Yes," he said. He reached for his pen immediately, which told her everything she needed to know about where he stood. "Yes, I will write it down right now." She left his office 20 minutes later with a signed, dated statement in Reverend Aldis's handwriting and a $1,500 discrepancy that no one had asked the Reverend about because no one had thought to ask him anything. It was a mistake on Grayson's part. The kind of mistake powerful men make when they have been powerful long enough to stop considering all the people they have overlooked. She was halfway back to the main road when she heard the voice behind her. "Mrs. Whitmore." She turned. Cord Purvis was leaning against the wall of the hardware store, with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. He was a broad man, not tall, with a stillness about him that was not the same kind of stillness as Caleb's. Caleb's stillness was the stillness of a man at ease. Purvis's stillness was the stillness of a man waiting. He was wearing the double-breasted coat. She looked at the buttons. Eagle stamp. Brass. One of them on the left side, third from the top, was newer than the others, shinier without the small scratches that came from a garment worn in rough country. A replacement button. She looked at his face. "Mr. Purvis," she said. Her voice was level. She was astonished at how level it was. "Heard you been busy," he said. "Visiting people, having conversations." "I visit people," she said. "I am a member of this community." "Sure." He smiled, but it did not reach anything behind it. "Just wanted to make sure you're keeping well." Widow woman alone out there in that cabin. Mountain country can be unpredictable. He paused the precise amount of time needed to let that land. "Accidents happen." She looked at him for 3 full seconds. "They do," she said. "I have learned that recently." She held his gaze until he was the one who looked away. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. Then she walked past him and did not look back. She walked at a steady pace until she turned the corner toward the post office road, and then she walked faster. Her heart was hitting hard against her ribs. Not from fear, or not only from fear. From fury. From the particular white-edged fury of standing 2 feet away from the man who had killed Thomas, and listening to him describe it as an accident, and not being able to do a single thing about it in that moment, except refuse to show him that she knew. She was back at the cabin in 12 minutes. She bolted the door and stood with her back against it and breathed. She was still standing there when she heard Caleb's horse. He came in and took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him about Purvis, about the replacement button, about the smile that was not a smile, and the word accident delivered with its full intended weight. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He's watching you," he said. "I is telling Grayson everything I do." She pushed off the door. "Which means Grayson knows I went to the Reverend this morning." "Does he know what Aldous told you?" "He knows I visited. He may not know the specifics yet." She went to the table. "Caleb, if Grayson realizes we're building something, if Purvis reports back that I've been to the Reverend, and Grayson puts it together with your return from the mountains and your inquiry at the telegraph office, he'll move," Caleb said. "He'll start eliminating the evidence before we can get it to a marshal." "How fast?" "Depends on how nervous he is." Caleb's jaw was set. Nervous enough men do stupid things fast. Grayson is not a stupid man, but he may be scared enough to act like one. She looked at him. "We need to move tonight." He was quiet. "The original records in the bank," she said. "I know you said we can't get to them legally, but I am not asking about getting to them legally. I am asking whether we can document their current state, their current altered state, in a way that a federal marshal can act on. If Grayson destroys them, the destruction itself becomes evidence, but only if someone outside the bank has already seen them and recorded what was there. You can't get into that bank at night." "No," she said, "but Ray Cutter can." She watched Caleb's face. "He's a deputy. He has legitimate access to town records under review. If he requests a look at the fund records this evening on official grounds, a routine matter, nothing unusual, He can document what the current records contain, what has been altered, what is present, and what is missing. And if Boone finds out Cutter has done that, Ray Cutter has already decided which side of this he is on, she said. He made that decision when he knocked on my door. I am not putting him somewhere he has not already chosen to stand. She paused. But we need to ask him tonight, before Purvis talks to Grayson and Grayson decides the records need to disappear. Caleb stood and went to the door and looked out toward the road. She could see him working through it not the way a cautious man avoids something, but the way a careful man makes sure he has seen all the angles before he moves. She recognized the difference. Thomas had moved that way. He turned around. "Send for Cutter," he said. She sent the Gilroy boy with a message that said only tonight 6 o'clock the back door. Cutter would understand. He arrived at 5 minutes to 6 with his coat collar up and the specific energy of a man who has spent a day making a decision and is committed enough to be nervous about it. She told him what she needed. Caleb sat at the kitchen table and let her run the conversation, which she appreciated without acknowledging, because the two of them were still figuring out the unspoken choreography of operating together under pressure. Cutter listened. He asked 2 precise questions, how many pages, and what specific entries to document, and then he sat for a moment with his hands on his knees. "If Boone finds out tonight," he started, "then by tomorrow we will have already sent everything to the federal marshal's office," Clara said. "And your evidence will be part of a federal case, not a local one. Boone cannot touch a federal case." "He can touch me. He can try," Caleb said from the table. It was not a bravado statement. It was a simple factual one, and it landed that way. Cutter looked at Caleb for a moment. Something passed between them, the particular recognition of men who have both decided to do something dangerous and find themselves doing it together. "All right," Cutter said. "I'll go in at 8. Routine records check. I'll document what I see and bring copies here before midnight." He left, and the wait began. It was the particular quality of waiting that Clara had not yet experienced in all of this. It's not the waiting of grief, which was heavy and formless, but the waiting of action, which was tight and specific and aware of every minute. She and Caleb sat in the kitchen and drank coffee they did not particularly want, and did not talk about what would happen if Cutter did not come back. At 11:40, there was a knock at the back door. Cutter came in fast and put 3 folded papers on the table. "I got them," he said. "But Mercer..." He looked at Caleb. "Grayson was there, not at the bank, at the alley behind it, when I came out. He didn't see me, but I saw him. He had someone with him." He paused. "Purvis." Clara and Caleb looked at each other. "They're moving tonight," Caleb said. "They're going to do something to those records tonight," Clara said. She was already on her feet. "Caleb, don't." His voice was sharp, and she stopped. "Listen to me. If Grayson destroys those records tonight, that is not a disaster. Cutter has documented copies. Aldous has his statement. We have Thomas's copies and the physical evidence from the canyon." He looked at Cutter. "Is there anything in those records that exists nowhere else?" Cutter thought fast. "The original withdrawal signatures, the forged ones. If he destroys the original pages, we lose the ability to directly compare. Then we need to get those specific pages out of that bank before he burns them." Caleb was already standing. He looked at Clara. "You stay here." "I will not." "Clara." He said her name the way a man says something that matters. "If this goes wrong tonight, someone needs to be here with the evidence we already have. Someone needs to be able to get to the federal marshal with everything if Cutter and I don't come back." He held her eyes. "That person is you. That has to be you." She hated it. She hated it with a specific grinding clarity, because she understood that he was right, and being right did not make it easier to stand still. "Go," she said. They went. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the silence, and held the folded copies Cutter had made in her hands, and she thought about Thomas lying on the canyon slope in the dark, and she thought about Caleb moving through the back streets of Red Hollow toward Grayson's bank, and she thought about the fact that she had spent 6 days telling herself she was not the kind of woman who stood still and waited. 40 minutes. Then she heard it not from the direction of the bank, but from the road. Not one horse. 3. She blew out the lamp. The hoofbeats slowed at her gate. She was already moving to the fireplace, to the chimney stone, pulling out the oilskin packet. She put everything together. Thomas's copies, Cutter's documentation, Aldous' statement, the forged letter into the oilskin, and pressed it flat inside the front of her dress against her body. Then she picked up Thomas's rifle from the corner where it had stood since the day she brought it in from the barn, and she went to the back door. She heard the front door come off its hinges. She was already running. The back field behind the cabin was dark, and she knew every inch of it. The soft ground near the old fence post, the dip that could turn an ankle if you didn't know it was coming, the break in the bottom rail where a person could slip through without slowing. She went through all of it at a pace that surprised her. The rifle in her right hand and the oilskin packet pressed hard against her chest, running toward the tree line and the mountain dark beyond it. Behind her the cabin went bright. She did not look back. She already knew what she would see. They had set it on fire. She ran. She ran until the tree line swallowed her, and the firelight behind her was reduced to a glow between the trunks. And then she ran further, because the men on those 3 horses were not going to sit at a burning cabin and watch it. They were going to look for her. She had to get to Caleb. She did not know if Caleb was safe. She did not let herself think about what it would mean if he wasn't. She kept moving up into the dark mountain above Red Hollow, with everything that could save Thomas's name pressed flat against her heart, and her husband's rifle in her hand, and the night around her enormous and cold and indifferent. She had never in her life felt more completely alone. She had never in her life felt more completely certain of what she was doing. Both things were true at once, and she carried them both, and she kept climbing. She climbed for 20 minutes before she stopped. Not because she was tired, though her lungs were burning, and her legs had started to tremble from the cold and the pace, but because running blind in mountain dark without a direction was not survival. It was panic. And Clara Whitmore had decided somewhere between her burning cabin and the tree line that she was finished with panic. She pressed her back against a pine trunk and listened. Below her she could hear voices. Not close enough to make out words, but close enough to know they were searching. Moving through the lower tree line in a spread pattern, the way men search when they expect to find something that cannot move very fast. They underestimated her. That was their mistake. She thought about Caleb. He had gone toward the bank with Cutter. The fire at her cabin would have been visible from the main street. If Caleb had seen the glow, and she believed he would have seen it, because Caleb was the kind of man who noticed everything that happened in the space around him, he would know. He would know she had run. He would know where she would go. She did not go toward town. She went up. There was a place in the high country above Red Hollow that she knew, because Thomas had taken her there once early in their 2nd year in the valley, on a Sunday afternoon, when the aspens were turning, and he wanted to show her the view. An old trapper's shelter barely standing, even then wedged into the rock face on the south slope above the canyon. Thomas had called it the most invisible building in Colorado. She had laughed. She had remembered it anyway, the way she remembered most things. Thomas showed her filed away in the part of her mind that kept the shape of the life they had built together. She went there now. It took her an hour and a half in the dark. She fell twice, once badly enough to scrape her palm open on a rock, and she kept going. The rifle was heavy, and she kept it anyway. The oilskin packet against her chest was the heaviest thing she carried, not in weight, but in what it meant, and she kept that most carefully of all. She reached the shelter as the moon came up enough to see by. She went inside and sat against the far wall with the rifle across her knees and the evidence pressed against her body, and she waited. She was good at waiting now. She had not been 2 weeks ago. She had been the kind of woman who filled silence with motion, cooking, gardening, mending, making things useful. But grief and necessity had taught her a different relationship with stillness, and she sat in the dark shelter on the south slope and was still, and she breathed and she thought. She thought about the specific decisions Grayson had just made. He had sent men to her cabin. He had burned it. He had authorized a search for her on the mountain in the middle of the night. These were not the decisions of a man who believed he was managing a controllable situation. These were the decisions of a man who was afraid. Grayson was afraid of her. That realization arrived with a particular kind of power that she had not expected. Not triumph. It was too dangerous a moment for triumph, but something solid and real, something that changed the character of what she was carrying. She was not a widow stumbling through something too large for her. She was a woman who had accumulated enough truth that the most powerful man in Red Hollow had set her house on fire to try to stop her. She heard something on the slope outside. She brought the rifle up in one smooth movement and held it. Quiet. Controlled. Thomas had taught her to shoot on their first winter in the valley, patient and methodical about it, and she had been a good student. A low whistle. 2 notes, short and deliberate. She knew that sound. She had heard it twice, once when Caleb arrived at the cabin before dawn 3 days ago, once when he knocked at the back door the morning after the church supper. She lowered the rifle. "In here," she said. He came through the opening and stopped when he saw her sitting against the wall with the rifle across her knees and the specific composed expression of a woman who has decided to be afraid later when she can afford it. Something moved across his face that he did not bother to conceal. "You're bleeding," he said. "My hand. I fell." She looked at the scrape without particular concern. "Cutter. Safe. He went out the back of the bank when he heard the horses on your road. He's at the Gilroy place." "Did he get the pages?" Caleb reached inside his coat and produced 4 folded papers. He set them on the floor between them. "The original withdrawal records with the forged signatures, all 4 pages. He paused. "Grayson got to the bank about 10 minutes after we left. I watched from the hardware store roof. He went in with Purvis, and they were in there for 40 minutes. He looked at her directly. When they came out, Purvis was carrying a leather case. He moved the records. He moved something. Whether it was the full set of originals or a selection, I don't know." Caleb sat down across from her and leaned his back against the opposite wall. "But he made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He moved them tonight, in a hurry, because of you." He held her gaze. "A man who destroys evidence cleanly in advance in his own time leaves nothing. A man who moves evidence in a panic in the middle of the night to a location he has not prepared, he leaves a trail." Clara thought about that. "You know where he took it?" "Purvis rode south. I tracked him for half a mile before I lost him in the dark. South of town, there are 3 properties large enough to hide a leather case of records: the Grayson Ranch House, the Henderson Mine Office, and the old relay station at the creek crossing." He paused. "The relay station belongs to a man named Foster, who has done business with Grayson for 15 years. "The relay station," she said. "That would be my first choice." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said things when he was certain. "It's 12 miles from town, far enough to feel safe, close enough to retrieve quickly." She looked at the 4 pages he had laid between them, the forged withdrawal records in a hand that was almost Thomas's, but not quite. She thought about the full set sitting in a leather case at a creek crossing 12 miles south, moved in a hurry by a frightened man. "We go to the relay station," she said. "Clara." "I know." She said it before he could finish. "I know what you are going to say. We have enough. We have enough right now to go to the federal marshal and open a case and let the legal process work. We do not need to ride 12 miles in the dark to retrieve records from a man who kills people." She kept her eyes on his. "Tell me I am wrong about the calculus." He was quiet. "If those original records disappear permanently," she said, "the forged signatures disappear with them. We have the copies Cutter documented, and we have these 4 pages you pulled from the bank. A skilled lawyer, and Grayson will have the best available, can argue that 4 loose pages are insufficient, that they could have been altered themselves, that without the original bound ledger to compare them against the chain of evidence is incomplete." She paused. "Thomas spent 4 months being careful. He copied those records by hand because he knew the originals were the thing that mattered. I am not going to let the originals disappear into a ranch house 12 miles from here because I was too cautious to go after them." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, not looking for a reason to refuse, but making sure he had seen all the costs clearly before he agreed. "2 conditions," he said. "Tell me. We send Cutter to the telegraph office at first light regardless of what happens tonight. Everything we have. The copies, the letter, the physical evidence from the canyon, he sends it all to Federal Marshal Daniel Crawford in Denver. We do not wait to see if we retrieve the originals first. The federal message goes either way. Agreed. What's the second? If we encounter Purvis or anyone else at that relay station, he said, we do not engage. We locate the records, we take them, we ride for the marshal's office directly. We do not stop in Red Hollow. She nodded. Agreed. He stood. Your hand needs wrapping. Later. Now, he said. He said it with a quiet firmness that was not an argument, but was not a request either, and she found that she did not particularly want to argue with it. He tore a strip from the hem of his shirt, she noticed, and said nothing, and wrapped her palm efficiently in the dark. They rode south. Caleb had left his horse half a mile up the slope on a picket line, and he brought it down, and they went double, because Clara's horse was at the cabin she no longer had, and neither of them mentioned it. She sat behind him with the rifle across her lap and the oilskin packet inside her coat, and the mountain dark moving past them. She had ridden this way once before behind Thomas on the afternoon. She had a mare with a thrown shoe, and Thomas was coming back from town at exactly the right moment. She had thought then that she was not accustomed to needing people, that she preferred her own competence to dependency. Thomas had said she could still hear his voice, that there was a difference between needing someone and choosing to ride with them, and that the difference mattered. She had not fully understood what he meant until tonight. They reached the relay station at the creek crossing 3 hours before dawn. Caleb stopped the horse a quarter-mile out, and they came the rest of the way on foot. Quiet, reading the ground, the way you read it when you do not know what is ahead of you. One horse at the post outside. A lamp burning inside. Someone was there. Caleb put his hand out to stop her, and they stood still and listened. One person. Moving around inside, the occasional creak of floorboards under deliberate pacing. Not the loose random movement of someone settling in for the night. The tight repeated movement of someone too anxious to sit still. Purvis was not the type who paced. Purvis was the type who waited in total stillness. Whoever was inside was not Purvis. Clara leaned close to Caleb's ear. Foster, she said, barely a breath. The man who owned the relay station. He nodded. He pointed to the right, the side window, low, the kind of window a station building had for ventilation. She nodded. They went around the back and came in from the far side of the building, and Caleb went through the door. She heard a shout, a crash of something, a chair, she thought, and she came in 3 steps behind him. Foster was a wiry man in his 50s, with the specific look of someone who had just had the 10 worst seconds of his life. He was pressed against the far wall with both hands up, and Caleb standing in the center of the room, looking at him with the calm patience of a man who has all the time in the world and is not actually angry, which was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. The leather case, Caleb said. Where is it? I don't know what you... Mr. Foster. Clara came forward. She let him see her face, a woman which he had not expected, and a woman with a rifle which he had expected even less. A man died. A man who had done nothing wrong except look too carefully at numbers that powerful people did not want examined. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and he was my husband, and the records that were brought to this station tonight are the only thing standing between the truth about his death and a lie that buries him forever. She looked at him without blinking. So I am going to ask you one time to tell me where that case is, and then Caleb Mercer is going to find it himself and take it. And the only question is whether you are on the right side of this when the federal marshal arrives in Red Hollow, which will be within the week. Foster looked at her. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the wall to his left in a way that was entirely involuntary and entirely informative. Caleb went to the wall, found the loose panel behind the station desk, and pulled out a leather case. He set it on the desk and opened it. Inside bound ledger books, 3 of them. And a separate folder of individual pages, the withdrawal records, the originals, with the forged signatures that were almost Thomas's handwriting, but not quite the ones that would show under examination exactly what Clara had told Caleb in her kitchen the morning after the church supper. She looked at the ledgers, and she looked at the withdrawal pages, and she thought of Thomas at the kitchen table with his copies spread out in front of him, making notes in the margins, being careful. "Thank you," she said to Foster, and she meant it without warmth, not cruelty, but the plain thanks of a woman who has gotten what she came for and has no excess emotion to spend on the man who was holding it for a murderer. They were back on the horse and riding north within 7 minutes. The marshal's office in Denver. That was the direction everything pointed now. But Red Hollow was between them and any road north, and Red Hollow, by this time, knew she was missing. "We can't go through town," she said. "There's a way around. Adds 4 miles. He was already adjusting his direction. "We go around. Cutter needs to know we have the originals. He needs to hold on the telegraph until we tell him what we have, so the message to Crawford is complete. The Gilroy place is at the north end of town. We can reach it without crossing Main Street." They went around and reached the Gilroy property as the first gray of dawn was beginning to soften the dark above the eastern ridgeline. Young Eli Gilroy, who was 16 and had done errands for Caleb for 3 years and for Clara for 2, and apparently understood without being told that something significant was happening, opened the back door before they knocked. Cutter was inside awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had been nursing for hours. He looked at them both at the leather case in Caleb's hand, and his eyes went wide. "You got the originals," he said. "We got the originals," Caleb said. He set the case on the table. Cutter opened it and looked at the ledgers and the withdrawal pages, and then looked up at Clara with an expression she did not have a word for, something between astonishment and the particular relief of a man who has been carrying guilt alone and is watching the weight begin to lift. "The telegram to Crawford," she said. "It needs to go today, this morning, before Grayson realizes what's missing from that relay station." "I'll go to the telegraph office when it opens at 7, Cutter said. "I'll send it as a deputy filing an official report of suspected federal crimes. That gives it jurisdictional weight. Crawford can't ignore an official deputy's request the way he might ignore a civilian complaint." "Good." She sat down because her legs had decided they were finished standing without being consulted. "What does the telegram need to say?" They spent 40 minutes drafting it at the Gilroy kitchen table, while Eli's mother, a small, serious woman who asked no questions and provided coffee and cornbread without being asked, moved around them with the particular grace of a woman who understood that something important was happening in her kitchen and that the most helpful thing she could do was feed the people doing it. The telegram was precise and complete. Cutter's name and badge number. A summary of the crimes alleged. A list of the evidence in hand. A request for immediate federal intervention in the matter of the Workers' Relief Fund theft and the suspected murder of Thomas Whitmore. And a specific request for Marshal Daniel Crawford by name, because Caleb had dealt with Crawford and knew him to be the kind of federal officer who moved when evidence warranted and was not susceptible to the kind of local pressure that men like Grayson excelled at applying. Cutter left at 7 with the telegram in his coat pocket and a composure that Clara respected enormously. She and Caleb sat at the Gilroy kitchen table, and she spread the original ledgers open in front of them, and they went through them page by page. The first one was straightforward, then the second one. Then halfway through the third, Caleb stopped turning pages. "Look at this," he said. She looked. The entry was for a transfer made 14 months ago, 7 months before Thomas had even joined the Oversight Committee. A transfer of $800 to an account identified only by a number. No recipient name. No purpose notation. Just the number and the amount, and a countersignature below Grayson's own. The countersignature was Elias Boone's. She stared at it. "He didn't just look the other way," she said. "He took money. He is not a hired accessory to a financial crime," Caleb said. "He is a participant in it. From the beginning." He kept his voice level, but she could hear what was underneath it. The particular controlled anger of a man who has spent 11 years watching a valley get squeezed by people who believed their own impunity. Every investigation Boone has conducted into the fund, every report he's filed, every statement he's made about Thomas, he was protecting himself as much as Grayson. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "The Territorial Office," she said. "The Colorado Springs records. If Boone's signature appears in the fund records, it will appear in the territorial copies too." "Yes?" He turned another page. "Which means when Crawford arrives and requests those territorial records, Boone is finished. There is no version of this where he claims he was deceived or uninformed. His own signature puts him in the room. She sat back. She thought about Boone standing at the church supper with his lemonade and his easy authority telling her that grief did things to a person's mind. She thought about the way he had looked at her patient, pitying certain of his own safety. She thought about Thomas. "I need to go back to Red Hollow," she said. Caleb looked up from the ledger. "I know what you're going to say," she continued before he could begin. "And I know it is not tactically necessary. We have the evidence. The telegram is sent. Crawford is coming. The right and sensible thing is to stay here or go further north and wait for the federal process to work." She looked at him steadily. "But Grayson is going to spend the next 3 or 4 days before Crawford arrives continuing to control the story in that town. He is going to use those days to shore up his version of events, to remind people of everything they believed about Thomas, to make sure that when the federal marshal arrives, he arrives in a town that is already decided." She paused. "I am not going to let that happen." Caleb looked at her for a long time. "What are you planning?" he asked. "I am going to walk into Red Hollow in broad daylight," she said, "and I am going to stand in the center of that town, and I am going to tell the truth in front of everyone who has been too afraid to ask for it. I am going to make it impossible for Grayson to quietly manage what happens next, because you cannot quietly manage something once it is already standing in the town square in plain sight." I was still looking at her. "They burned your home," he said. "I know. Purvis is in that town. I know that too. You could be arrested on whatever charge Boone decides to manufacture." "I could," she said. "But I have a deputy who will have sent a federal telegram by this hour who will stand as a witness to anything Boone does in the next 24 hours. And I have the original records in a leather case that do not exist anywhere that Grayson can reach them." She met his eyes. "And I have you." He was quiet. "I am not going to sit at the Gilroy kitchen table," she said, "and wait for a federal marshal to come fix what the people of this town participated in. Not when I can walk in there and put the truth in front of them while they still have the chance to choose something different." Her voice did not waver. "Thomas deserves to have his name restored by the community that took it from him. Not just by a legal process that happens to him. By the people who decided he was guilty without asking a single question. They need to say it out loud where everyone can hear." Caleb looked at her across the table. The woman who had sat alone at a church supper 11 days ago with an untouched plate and her spine straight and her hands pressed flat against the wood, and he did not argue with her anymore. "Then we go together," he said. "I was hoping you'd say that." They reached the edge of Red Hollow at 9:45 in the morning. The leather case was secured behind Caleb's saddle wrapped in canvas. Clara's oilskin packet was inside her coat. Thomas's rifle she had left with Eli Gilroy, because she was not going into Red Hollow looking like a threat. She was going in looking like what she was, a woman who had nothing left to hide and nothing left to lose, and every reason in the world to stand in the middle of Main Street and tell the truth. She walked in with her head up. People stopped. Not the way they had stopped at the church supper, not the avoidance, the turning away. They stopped and stared, because Clara Whitmore, whose cabin had been burning at midnight, whose name had been associated with a criminal husband for 11 days, was walking down the main street of Red Hollow in the morning sun as if she had every right to be there, which she thought she did. She stopped in front of the Grayson Bank and turned to face the street. "I need everyone to listen to me," she said. Her voice carried clear and direct the voice of a woman who had stopped being careful. "I know most of you have already decided what kind of woman I am. You decided it the same way you decided what kind of man Thomas was without asking a single question. I am here to ask you to listen to the questions you should have asked 11 days ago." People were stopping. Shopkeepers appeared in doorways. A woman with a market basket stood still at the edge of the boardwalk. "Thomas Whitmore did not steal from the Workers' Relief Fund," she said. "He found the theft. He documented it. He was killed for it. And the men who killed him have been standing in front of you every Sunday, shaking hands, and you have been thanking them for their service to this community." She heard the bank door open behind her. She did not turn around. She heard the bank door, and she kept her eyes on the people in the street. Walter Grayson's voice came from directly behind her, smooth and controlled, and carrying the particular authority of a man who has never had to raise it to be heard. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I would strongly advise you to stop speaking." She turned then slowly and deliberately, because she wanted him to see her face when she did it. I was standing in the doorway of his bank in his good suit with his silver watch chain and the expression of a man who has spent 20 years being the most important person in every room and has not yet fully processed that this morning is different. Behind him, 2 steps back, Cord Purvis stood with his arms at his sides and his coat buttoned and all 4 original buttons in place. "Mr. Grayson," she said. Her voice was steady, and she was glad of it. "I am going to say what I came here to say, and then the people of this town are going to decide what to do with it." "The people of this town," he said, "have already decided. They decided when the evidence was presented." "You presented evidence," she said. "That is a different thing." She raised her voice so the gathering crowd could hear clearly. "The Workers' Relief Fund has been losing money for 9 months. Not because Thomas stole it. Because Walter Grayson has been withdrawing it into accounts that have no names on them, only numbers, and the sheriff of this town has been co-signing those withdrawals since the beginning." She let that land. "Thomas found it. Thomas documented it. And when he tried to bring the truth forward, a man named Cord Purvis followed him into the mountains and made sure he never came back." Purvis moved. He came forward 2 steps, and his hand went to the gun at his hip, and Caleb was already there. Not running, not dramatic, just stepping forward from Clara's right side and placing himself in the space between Clara and Purvis, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has done difficult things in tight spaces before and is not particularly nervous about doing them again. "That's far enough," Caleb said, quietly, directly, in the way that men who mean things say them. Purvis stopped. The crowd had gone completely silent. "Cord Purvis," Clara said, turning to the gathered people and letting them see her face, her composure, the absolute absence of desperation in anything about her, rode with the search party that found my husband's body. The search party, organized by the sheriff, who had co-signed fraudulent withdrawals. I have a button from Purvis's coat. The original button, not the replacement. He put on after the night. Thomas died, recovered from the canyon rim, by Caleb Mercer, who has been in those mountains for 11 years and knows what gets left behind when a man does not go over a canyon edge willingly. She looked at Purvis directly. He bought a replacement button at the Denver catalog store. I noticed the difference the day he threatened me on this road. Purvis's hand was still near his gun. Grayson said very quietly, "Elias." And Sheriff Elias Boone came around the corner of the bank from the alley side, which told her he had been there already, positioned waiting. He had his badge and his authority and his 7 months of co-signed fraudulent withdrawals, and he came forward with his hand on his own weapon and his eyes on Caleb. "Mercer," he said, "step aside." "I don't believe I will," Caleb said. "I am ordering you." "On what charge?" Ray Cutter's voice came from the far end of the street. He was walking down the center of the road with his deputy's badge on his coat and a piece of paper in his hand, and the specific bearing of a young man who has decided exactly who he is going to be and is not going to change his mind about it. "On what charge are you ordering a citizen to step aside, Sheriff? I'd like to hear it stated clearly, in front of witnesses." Boone looked at Cutter. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition Clara thought of the specific shape of something he had not considered. He had not considered his own deputy. "You send that telegram," Boone said. His voice had lost something, not the authority, not yet, but the certainty underneath it. "Sent it at 7:15 this morning," Cutter said. He held up the paper. "And got a response at 8:40. Federal Marshal Daniel Crawford is already riding. He will be in Red Hollow by tomorrow noon." He looked at Boone steadily. "You have about 27 hours, Sheriff, to decide whether you want to be the man who obstructed a federal investigation or the man who cooperated with one." The crowd was very still. Clara watched Grayson's face. She had been watching it since she turned around. She had watched it through her speech and through Purvis's movement and through Cutter's arrival, and she had seen something happen in it, that she recognized the specific collapse that happens when a man who has controlled a narrative realizes the narrative has gotten away from him. It was not dramatic. It was quiet. a kind of settling like a wall absorbing a weight it was not built to carry. Mrs. Whitmore. Harold Pence's voice came from the right, from where he had been standing near the boardwalk in front of his feed store. He stepped forward into the street. His voice was not loud, but it was clear. "I want to say something." Everyone looked at him. He had the face of a man walking toward something difficult that he had been avoiding for months, and finding that the walking was easier than the avoiding had been. "I sat on that fund committee," he said. "I knew the numbers were wrong 2 months before Thomas died. I knew, and I told myself I was misremembering because the alternative—" He stopped. "Because the alternative was admitting that I had noticed something and said nothing, while a man I respected was building a case that was going to get him killed." His voice cracked on the last 2 words, and he let it crack and kept going. Thomas Whitmore was not a thief. He was the only man on that committee with the courage to look at what was actually in those records. And I am going to say that in front of a federal marshal tomorrow, and in front of every person in this town right now, and however many more times it needs to be said, silence. Then Reverend Aldous walked forward from somewhere in the back of the gathered crowd slowly, with his white hair and his soft face and his signed statement folded in his coat pocket, and stood beside Harold Pence. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Grayson said, "This is slander. This is a widow's grief talking, and I will not stand here and—" "The original records," Clara said. She turned to Caleb. He unstrapped the canvas-wrapped leather case from behind the saddle and held it where the crowd could see it. "The fund ledgers, 3 volumes. The individual withdrawal pages with signatures that are not my husband's handwriting. That I can demonstrate are not my husband's handwriting, with 11 years of his correspondence to compare them against. Transaction records showing transfers to numbered accounts." She looked at the crowd, at the miners' families, at the women from the church supper, at the men who had moved their chairs away, and the children who had been steered past her. "These are the things Thomas died trying to bring to daylight. We retrieved them last night from the relay station at the creek crossing, where they were moved in a hurry by a frightened man." She paused. "Cord Purvis moved them, on Walter Grayson's orders. Purvis moved again, faster this time. He did not draw the gun. Some calculation in him decided against it, or the calculation simply didn't happen fast enough. But he turned and he ran back through the bank doorway and through the bank toward the back exit. And 2 things happened simultaneously. Caleb went after him, and 3 miners from the Henderson claim men, whose dues money had been sitting in that relief fund for years, stepped forward and blocked the back alley before Purvis reached it. She heard the scuffle. It was brief. She kept her eyes on Grayson, who was still standing in the bank doorway. He had not run. She had not expected him to. Grayson was not a man who ran. He was a man who negotiated, who managed, who found the angle that left him standing when everything else fell. He was looking at the crowd, and the records, and Cutter, and the people who had just stepped forward, and he was doing the mathematics of his situation with the rapid, practiced precision of a man who has done financial mathematics his whole life. He did not like what the numbers added up to. "Elias," he said again, quieter, different. Not an order this time, almost a question. Boone was looking at Cutter. He was looking at the paper in Cutter's hand, the telegram response, Crawford's name on it, the word federal. He was doing mathematics too. "I am not going to prison for you, Walter," he said. His voice was barely audible, but the street was so quiet that it carried. It was the most honest thing Elias Boone had said in 7 months. Grayson's face went still in a way that was different from composure. It was the stillness of a man standing in a place he built for himself, watching it come down. "Walter Grayson," Cutter said from the center of the street, with his badge and his telegram and his 23 years of life leading to this exact moment. "I am placing you under detention pending federal investigation into charges of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. You can walk to the jail cooperatively or—" "I will cooperate," Grayson said, quietly, still managing, still even now calculating that cooperation bought something. "I will cooperate fully." He walked. Boone walked beside him without being asked, which was its own statement. Cutter fell in behind them. The crowd parted, and the most powerful man in Red Hollow walked down the main street of the town he had controlled for 12 years with a deputy, 2 steps behind him and his sheriff beside him, and the evidence of everything he had done sitting in a canvas-wrapped leather case on a horse in front of the bank. Clara watched them go. She stood in the middle of the street and watched Walter Grayson and Elias Boone walk past the people they had manipulated and frightened and stolen from, and something inside her that had been rigid for 11 days released. Not all at once, not a collapse, not a flood. Just a slow, deliberate unlocking, like a fist opening one finger at a time. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him the way she would think about him for the rest of her life. Not just in grief, not just in the sharp, specific pain of his absence, but in something more complicated and more enduring. She thought about him at the kitchen table, with his ledger copies. She thought about him on the trail in the dark, riding toward something he knew was dangerous, because he believed it mattered. She thought about him bringing her wildflowers for no reason, and laughing at his own jokes, and telling her there was a difference between needing someone and choosing to stand with them. He had been right about that. He had been right about most things. Caleb came back from the alley. He was not entirely neat about it. There was a split at his lower lip that was going to be sore for a week, but he was standing straight, and Purvis was between 2 Henderson miners behind him, wrists bound with a length of rope that Caleb had apparently had on him, which she thought was very like him. He came to stand beside her. She looked at his lip. "You should have that looked at," she said. "It's fine." "You should have it looked at," she said again, because some things bore repeating, and because she was discovering that the particular relief of a crisis concluded expressed itself in her case as the sudden capacity to care about small things again. He almost smiled. The same almost smile she had seen at the kitchen table the morning she told him she was afraid, but had no intention of letting it stop her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The crowd around them was beginning to move again, not dispersing, not yet, but stirring the way people stir when something enormous has just happened, and the first instinct is to turn to the person nearest you and confirm that you both saw the same thing. She heard voices beginning. Harold Pence talking to one of the miners, Reverend Aldous with a woman from the church, Women's Auxiliary. 2 men she recognized as Henderson claim workers, speaking rapidly and with considerable heat about the relief fund and what they were owed. The town of Red Hollow was waking up. Not the comfortable, self-satisfied wakefulness of a community sure of its own judgments. Something rawer than that. Something that had the quality of a reckoning. A woman came forward from the crowd. Clara did not know her well. She was the wife of one of the miners, a practical-looking woman in her 40s with 2 children close behind her. She stopped in front of Clara. "Your cabin," the woman said. "It burned last night." "It did," Clara said. "My husband and I have a spare room, larder's full." She said it the way practical women say necessary things plainly without performance. "You'll stay with us until you figure out what comes next." Clara looked at her. She had not thought about what came next. She had been so focused on what had to happen first that what came after it had not fully existed yet. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that the simple words didn't entirely carry. The woman nodded and went back to her children, and Clara stood in the street with the morning sun on her, and the leather case of her husband's vindication behind her, and a man beside her who had split his lip on her behalf, and she thought that Red Hollow looked different than it had 11 days ago, though she could not say precisely what had changed in the physical fact of it. What had changed, she understood, was not the town. It was what the town knew about itself now. Federal Marshal Daniel Crawford arrived the following day at 11 in the morning, 40 minutes before noon, riding a bay horse and accompanied by 2 deputies, and the specific, purposeful composure of a man who has read a telegram carefully and knows exactly what he is riding into. High went first to the jail where Grayson and Boone were being held. Cutter had put them there with a calm efficiency that Clara thought was the finest work of his young career, and had stayed through the night to make sure nothing changed. Then Crawford came to the house where Clara was staying, and she sat across from him at a kitchen table. Not her kitchen table, but a table with coffee she had not made herself and Caleb beside her, and she put everything in front of him. The original fund ledgers, the withdrawal records with the forged signatures, Thomas's copied pages with his margin notes, Cutter's documentation from the night of the bank visit. Reverend Aldis's signed statement with the $1,500 discrepancy. Harold Pence's account of Grayson's threat. The rope and the torn paper, and the replacement button from the canyon. The letter from Grayson to Boone. And Caleb's testimony about the trail, the moonlight, the single dangerous point, and the 11 years of knowledge that made his account of what had not been an accident credible and specific and impossible to dismiss. Crawford read and listened for 2 hours. When he was finished, he sat for a moment and looked at the table. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "your husband was a careful man." "He was," she said. "This is a complete case." He said it without enthusiasm and without drama, the way a man who has assembled complete cases before recognizes the thing. "I have everything I need to proceed on the fraud charges immediately. The murder charge will require a formal inquest, but with the physical evidence and the testimony you can provide about Purvis and the canyon, yes." He looked at her steadily. "Yes. Thomas's name," she said. "I need to know that his name will be formally cleared, not implied, not left to inference. Formally on record, documented in such a way that anyone who asks in 20 years will find the truth." Crawford looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, but was close to it, the look of a man encountering a precision he had not expected. "I will include a formal exoneration in my report to the Territorial Office," he said, "and I will make a public statement before I leave Red Hollow, specifically naming Thomas Whitmore as the man who identified this fraud and died for it." He paused. "He will be recorded as the one who brought this forward. That is accurate. That is what the record will show." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Thank you," she said. Crawford made his public statement that afternoon on the steps of the sheriff's office, which was now for practical purposes Ray Cutter's office, a development that Cutter appeared to be handling with the slightly dazed composure of a man who has received a great deal of responsibility in a very short time. The statement was brief and direct, and said exactly what Crawford had promised. Thomas Whitmore had not been a thief. Thomas Whitmore had been a man of integrity who discovered a systematic fraud against the workers of his community and was murdered to prevent him from exposing it. The record of the territorial investigation would reflect his role clearly and completely. The crowd that gathered was larger than the one on the main street the day before. Workers from the Henderson claim who had ridden in when word spread. Families from the outer properties. People who had not been at the church supper and had not been on the main street, but had heard what was happening in Red Hollow and came to hear it for themselves. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd and listened to her husband's name restored in plain language by a federal officer in front of the people who had taken it from him, and she did not cry. She had made herself a promise about that, standing in front of a mirror in a black dress 11 days ago, and she found that even now, even here, the promise held. Not because she did not feel it. She felt it in every part of her, a grief and a relief and a love so thoroughly intertwined that she could not have separated one from the others, but because the tears when they came were going to be hers alone. Not a performance for the town that had earned nothing from her. She would cry later in private for a long time. For now she stood in the afternoon sun and heard Thomas's name said with the truth attached to it, and she let that be enough. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about what came next was simple, and she had stopped expecting it to be. The territorial court proceedings required her testimony twice. The formal inquest into Thomas's death produced the documentation she had asked for. Cord Purvis charged with murder. Grayson and Boone charged with fraud, conspiracy, and complicity in Thomas's death. The full weight of the territorial legal system brought to bear with the kind of thoroughness that only happens when federal attention has been focused precisely on the right place. Purvis, faced with the physical evidence from the canyon and the testimony of 3 witnesses to his attempted flight, was convicted in 6 weeks. He did not appear to find this surprising. He had the look at sentencing of a man who has always known the bill would eventually come due. Grayson's trial took 3 months. His lawyers were very good. The evidence was better. He was convicted on 11 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy in Thomas's death. He sold his dignified posture in the courtroom by the 2nd week and never found it again. Boone took a plea. He cooperated. His testimony against Grayson was devastating and probably saved him from a worse sentence. He left the territory before Clara had a chance to feel anything complicated about him, which she decided was just as well. Harold Pence testified. He told the truth, all of it, in a clear voice that did not waver, and his testimony about the quarterly totals and Grayson's threat was among the most damning evidence presented. He came to Clara afterward and said he was sorry, which she accepted without commenting on whether it was enough, because she was no longer in the business of deciding what was enough for other people. That was their work to do. Reverend Aldous held a memorial service for Thomas, a real one. The kind Thomas had not gotten the first time, with a proper eulogy, and the church full, and the hymns sung by people who were there because they wanted to be. He said that Thomas Whitmore had been a man who understood that integrity was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite it. He said he hoped they would all be worthy of that definition before they were finished. Clara sat in the front pew and thought that Thomas would have been embarrassed by all of it and deeply moved and would have made a joke afterward to cover the being moved, and she smiled at nothing in particular for the first time in 2 months. 6 months after the church supper, she stood in front of a building on Red Hollow's Main Street with a sign being hung above the door. Whitmore Supply and Sewing. She had planned it through the court proceedings, sketched it out in a borrowed notebook at the kitchen table of the woman who had offered her a spare room, and turned out to be one of the finest people she had encountered in 11 years of Colorado mountain living. She had filed the business claim with the territorial office with Ray Cutter's help, using Thomas's name and her own, because the business was a continuation of what Thomas had begun, even if he was not there to see it. She had the workers' back pay from the Territorial Restitution Fund. The money Grayson had stolen was partially recovered, and the miners were compensated not fully, but substantially. She had her skills and her 11 years of mountain living knowledge. And she had something she had not had on the morning she walked into that church supper with her basket of bread and her preserves. She had a community that knew what she had done, not all of them. Some people in Red Hollow had moved their chairs and intended to keep them moved, and she had accepted that this was how people were and had stopped expecting otherwise. But enough of them, enough to matter enough to fill a store and sustain a business and make a life, had come to understand that the woman they had abandoned at that table in the summer heat had been carrying the truth the whole time and had refused to put it down. Caleb came down from the mountain in October when the grazing season ended. He walked into the new store on a Tuesday morning with a small canvas sack in one hand and his hat in the other, and the same unhurried, undemonstrative manner with which he had done everything she had ever seen him do. He set the sack on the counter. "Coffee," he said. "From the Denver supplier. Thomas's brand. I asked Eli Gilroy what you ordered." She looked at the sack. She thought about Thomas saying life was too short for bad coffee standing in this same valley in a kitchen that was ashes now, and she thought that was true, and that Thomas had been right about it, the way he had been right about most things, and that the life that was too short for bad coffee was also the life that had led her here to this store with her husband's name above the door and a mountain man standing at her counter with good coffee and his hat in his hand. "Do you still have the preserves?" he asked. She looked at him. "I have strawberry," she said. "From this summer's batch. I was hoping you might." He set his hat on the counter. He looked at her across the wooden surface with the same directness he had brought to her kitchen table that morning, with the evidence spread between them, the same directness he had brought to a church supper table 11 days into the worst period of her life. "I was also hoping," he said, and then he stopped and started again, which she found she liked very much, the slight roughness of it, the honesty of a man who does not have a smooth version of this particular conversation prepared. "I was hoping I might come by more regularly, if that would suit you." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him the way she had thought about him every day for 6 months, and would think about him for the rest of her life, with love, with grief, with the specific tenderness of a woman who had carried someone else's courage through mountain darkness and come out the other side. He had told her there was a difference between needing someone and choosing to stand with them. She understood now that he had been teaching her something. She thought he would be glad she had learned it. "It would suit me," she said. Caleb nodded once. No performance, no excess. Just a man and a woman in a supply store with a name above the door and a jar of strawberry preserves between them and the whole Colorado mountain autumn outside, and whatever came after it, waiting the way good things wait, patient, unhurried, certain of its own arrival. She put the coffee on. Their story had not begun with a rescue. It had not begun with a declaration or a bargain or any of the things that people in towns like Red Hollow thought love required. It had begun at a table where every other chair was empty, with a man who looked at a woman. The whole world had decided to abandon and chose without drama or calculation to sit beside her. Because there are people in this world who see clearly, who refuse to let the noise of other people's certainty drown out what they know to be true, who walk into the middle of a crowd's judgment and sit down quietly on the wrong side of it and say, "Not today, not this woman, not on my watch." Thomas Whitmore had been that kind of person. He had died being that kind of person. And the man who had sat beside his widow at a church supper on a summer afternoon in 1883 had been that kind of person too. Clara poured 2 cups and pushed one across the counter, and the September light came through the front window of the store that bore her husband's name and the name she had chosen to keep, and the life she had refused to let them take from her, continued steadily, fully, and with every right in the world, to be exactly what it was. Some people leave a light behind them when they go. Thomas Whitmore had left his. Clara had carried it through the dark until it could burn on its own. And that every bit of that was enough.